Story 1. The Break Room at Highland Foods. Part 1. My name is Simone. I am 27 years old, and I want to tell you about a Wednesday night in November when I was working the overnight stock shift at Highland Foods in Lexington, Kentucky, and I walked into the break room at 2:20 in the morning and found my bag open on the bench with everything inside, shifted around in a way that told me immediately and with complete certainty that someone else's hands had been in it. The thunderstorm outside had been going for 2 hours, and the loading dock door at the back of the store had been rattling in the wind all night. And I had been telling myself every time I heard it that it was just the weather. I want to tell you about the moment I understood that the rattling dock door and my open bag and the camera lens covered with a wet napkin were all the same story. Drop a comment before we go further and tell me if you have ever worked an overnight shift alone, because this one is for you. Part 2. Highland Foods was a large, independent grocery, the kind that had been in that part of Lexington for 20 years and ran on the loyalty of the neighborhood rather than on a corporate brand. The overnight shift ran from 11 to 7, and on a full crew, it was 4 or 5 people. But on a Wednesday in November, it was 3 me and 2 other stockers named Darnell and Keisha, each of us working a separate section of the store. The manager on duty was a man named Phil, who did his check-in at midnight and then spent most of the night in the office doing inventory paperwork, which meant the floor was ours. The store closed to customers at midnight. After that, it was quiet in the specific way a large grocery store is quiet at 2 in the morning. The hum of the refrigeration units running along the back wall, the occasional clank of a cart, the rain on the flat roof above the produce section. I liked overnight shifts for the same reason most overnight stockers do. The store to yourself, the work straightforward. No customers asking where things are. My break room bag was a canvas tote I had been using for 2 years. I kept my phone charger in it, my wallet, a change of socks, a granola bar, the small notebook I used for my personal to-do lists. I knew exactly how it sat when I left it. Handles folded to the right, zipper facing up the notebook, visible at the top. I walked in at 2:20 for my break, and the bag was sitting with the handles folded to the left, and the zipper facing the bench, and the notebook pushed to the bottom under everything else. Part 3. I stood there looking at it for a moment, and then I went through it carefully. Everything was present. My wallet with the cards and the cash still inside. My phone charger, the granola bar, the notebook. Nothing taken, but my employee badge wasn't on the zipper pull, where I always clipped it. It was inside the bag tucked under the notebook, placed there by someone who had unclipped it from the zipper, looked at it, and put it back without thinking, to return it to the place they had found it. I held the badge and looked at it. It was a standard Highland Foods employee access card. Photo ID on the front, magnetic strip on the back. The strip opened 3 things in the building. The break room door itself, which was always propped open during shift anyway. The loading dock control panel, which raised and lowered the dock door. And the manager's office and the attached stock room, where the weekly cash float was kept in a lockbox. Someone had taken my badge out of its clip and looked at it and put it back. I looked at the camera in the corner of the break room. It was a small dome unit mounted near the ceiling standard for the building, the kind that fed to the monitor in Phil's office. There was a folded paper napkin sitting on top of the dome, wet pressed against the lens. It had not been placed there carelessly. It was centered on the lens, and the weight of the moisture was keeping it flat against the glass. Part 4. I went and found Darnell in the cereal aisle and asked him quietly if he had been in the break room in the last hour. He said no. He had been on the floor since his break at midnight. I went to frozen foods and asked Keisha the same thing. She said she had not been in the break room since 11:30. I went to Phil's office and told him what I'd found. Phil was the kind of manager who responded to things at his own pace, and I watched his pace change when I put the badge on his desk in front of him and told him about the napkin on the camera. He pulled up the store camera system on his office monitor without saying anything. He went back through the loading dock camera from the beginning of the shift. At 11:45 p.m., 14 minutes before the store closed to customers, the loading dock door appeared on the feed doing something it should not have been doing. It opened from the outside, not the motorized raise of a scheduled delivery. A manual override the door lifting about 2 feet, and then stopping, and a figure rolling underneath it and pulling it back down from the inside. 11:45. An hour and 15 minutes before I found my bag. Phil looked at the timestamp and then at me, and then he picked up his phone. Part 5. The figure on the dock camera had moved into the loading area, and then the feed lost them at the edge of the camera's coverage. Phil switched through the interior cameras one by one, receiving area, stockroom, corridor, freezer hall, main floor perimeter. Nothing visible on any of them until he got to the camera, covering the hallway between the freezer units and the back stockroom. At 12:52 a.m., the figure appeared in that hallway, moving slowly close to the wall in the section of the hallway that had the weakest overhead lighting. They moved toward the stockroom door, which was the door my employee badge opened, and stopped at it. Stood there for about 30 seconds, then moved back toward the freezer section and out of the frame. They had been in the building for over 2 hours. They had found my bag in the break room, identified my badge, tried the stockroom door, and gone back to wait. For what, Phil said quietly, was the cash lockbox in the stockroom, which on Wednesday night held the weekly float for Thursday morning's change drawers. $3,000 in small bills, standard procedure, locked in a box, that a person with my badge and enough time could access, because the stockroom door was the outer layer, and the lockbox inside had a 4-digit code that was written on a Post-it note on Phil's desk that I could see from where I was standing. Phil was on the phone with 911, and I was standing in his office doorway when the lights went out. Part 6. The lightning strike that killed the power was close enough that the crack came before the darkness. A single sharp sound, and then every overhead light in the building going off simultaneously. The refrigeration units stayed on their own circuit, but their hum changed pitch in the sudden dark, and the emergency lighting, a strip of low battery-powered units near the floor, gave everything a flat red tint that made the store feel like a different building entirely. Phil was on the phone, and I was in the doorway, and I had my phone flashlight on before the emergency lights finished cycling. The stockroom was 12 feet to my left down the hallway. I turned right toward the main floor, which was the direction of Darnell and Keisha and the front of the store. The hallway between the freezer units and the stockroom was the route I would have taken to reach the main floor fastest. I turned into it and walked 6 feet, and I heard breathing. Not the ambient sound of the building, not the refrigeration units. Breathing 3 feet in front of me in the red-tinted dark, the specific involuntary sound of a person who has been still for a long time in a confined space and does not move fast enough when someone enters their space unexpectedly. I turned my phone flashlight directly forward and I saw a man in dark clothing standing between two freezer units with a backpack on and his hands at his sides and his eyes catching the light the way eyes do when a beam hits them suddenly. I hit the freezer unit door to my right with my full body weight, and it swung open into the main aisle, and I ran, and I screamed Darnell's name as loud as I could from the top of my lungs, and I kept running. Part 7. Darnell heard me from the paper goods aisle, and he was moving toward my voice before I reached him. Keisha came from the other direction. We all three went to the front of the store to the checkout lanes, and Phil came out of the office corridor 30 seconds later, still on the phone with the dispatcher. We went out the front doors and stood in the rain in the parking lot, and we did not go back inside. The Lexington police units arrived in 9 minutes. 4 officers went in through the front, while a 5th covered the loading dock. They found the man in the stockroom, which he had entered, using the magnetic override from the door panel, a method that worked without my badge, because the power outage had defaulted the stockroom door to its fail-open state. He was inside the stockroom with the lockbox on the floor in front of him and a drill attachment in his hand from the backpack. He had a prior conviction for commercial burglary in a neighboring county. He had been in the building for 2 hours and 51 minutes. Part 8. Phil gave me 3 days paid leave and a formal letter of commendation that I did not know what to do with. The store installed a new break room camera within the week, replacing the dome unit with a model that had a tamper sensor triggering an alert if anything contacted the lens. They also moved the cash float procedure to a different schedule, so the lockbox was never holding more than $500 on any given overnight. I requested a shift change to days and got it within 2 weeks. What I cannot stop thinking about is 11:45. The dock door opening and a person sliding underneath it 14 minutes before the store closed to the public, which means they were in that building while customers were still shopping. They found the break room and my bag and the camera while the store still had people in it, and they settled in and waited for everyone to leave. They had been patient enough to wait 2 hours and 51 minutes for the building to be empty enough to work in. That is not a person acting on impulse. That is a person who made a plan and worked it. The napkin on the camera lens was the detail I keep returning to. Weight-centered, weighted just right. Someone who knew where the camera was and how to cover it without reaching up and being obvious about it. Someone who had thought about this specific room in this specific building before they ever got inside it. Know where your badge is. Know what it opens. And know that the things you carry to work every night carry information about the building you work in, and that information is worth something to someone who is paying attention. Story 2. The Wrong Floor, Part 1. My name is Patrick. I am 38 years old, and I want to tell you about a Tuesday night in February when I was working late alone in my accounting firm's office on the 14th floor of a commercial building in downtown Denver, Colorado. And the elevator opened, and a man stepped out who told me he had the wrong floor, and I believed him. And then 15 minutes later, the elevator opened again, and he was back. It was 11:10 at night, and the thunderstorm outside had turned the building's windows into a continuous sound, and I was the only person on the 14th floor, and probably one of 4 or 5 people in the entire building. I want to tell you about the moment the KG thickened into actual darkness when the power went, and I heard footsteps coming up the stairwell. Stay with me on this one, because the detail about the building's temporary access cards changes everything about what this man had been doing and how long he had been doing it. Part 2. The office was a mid-sized accounting firm 8 partners, 20 staff, the kind of practice that occupied a full floor of a commercial tower and ran at normal capacity during business hours and went quiet by 7 in the evening. I stayed late 3 or 4 times a month during reporting season, the kind of session that started after dinner and went until midnight, or one just me and the hum of the building's ventilation and the city lights through the windows on 3 sides. The 14th floor had a reception desk at the elevator lobby, 6 private offices along the east and west walls, a conference room, a kitchen, and an open plan area with 8 workstations that was empty and dark when I was the only one there. My office was the second from the north end of the east wall, which put me with my back to the window and a direct sightline to the corridor leading to the elevator lobby if I turned around. I had been there since 9. The storm had come in around 10, and by 11 it was serious lightning close to the building, the windows flexing slightly in the pressure changes from each strike. The building was a modern high-rise, and the flex was normal and engineered for, but it was not the kind of thing you stopped noticing. At 11:10 I heard the elevator. The elevator on 14 had a specific sound, the doors opening with a tone and a mechanical slide that carried clearly in a quiet floor. I heard it, and I assumed it was building security doing their rounds, which happened twice a night on a rolling schedule, and usually reached 14 somewhere between 10 and midnight. The man who came through the lobby door was not building security. He was in civilian clothes, dark jacket carrying a laptop bag, and he came through the glass door from the lobby and looked around the floor, and then looked at me and said he was sorry. He thought this was 13. His company was on 13. He said it casually, with the mild embarrassment of someone who had pushed the wrong button, and he turned around and went back through the lobby door to the elevator. I turned back to my screen. Part 3. At 11:25, the elevator sounded again. I turned around. The same man came through the lobby door. This time, he did not offer an explanation. He stood in the doorway between the lobby and the open plan area, and he looked at me, and he asked if anyone else was in the office tonight. I looked at him. I said yes, there were a few people in the back, which wasn't true, and I asked if I could help him with something. He looked past me toward the dark corridor behind my office, and then he looked back at me and he said, "No, he was fine," and he went back to the elevator lobby. I turned to my screen, and I watched the reflection in the dark window behind my monitor. The lobby glass door was visible in the reflection, and I watched it, and I counted. 10 seconds. He was still in the lobby. 15 seconds. 20. 25 seconds. At 30 seconds, the reflection showed him moving, going back to the elevator, and then a few moments later, the elevator tone as the doors opened and closed. I sat with my hands on the keyboard, and I did not type anything. I thought about both visits. The first one had been calibration. He had come out, seen me, assessed the floor, gone back. The second had been confirmation. He had come back specifically to ask whether I was alone, and he had framed it as a casual question. But it was not a casual question. It was the specific question that someone asks when the answer matters to their next decision. Part 4. I called building security from my desk phone. The guard on duty, a man named Howard, answered, and I told him there had been a man on 14 twice in the past 20 minutes who had given an explanation the first time that I found increasingly unconvincing, and had come back a second time to ask if I was alone. Howard said he would check the access log and come up. He called me back in 4 minutes. His voice was different when he called back, more careful. The access log for the building showed the man's entry using a temporary day pass. Temporary day passes were issued at the front desk for visitors and contractors and were valid for 1 calendar day. This one had been issued 3 months ago to a visitor from a company on the 8th floor. The 8th floor company had relocated 6 months before that, and the space had been vacant for 6 months. The temp pass had never been surrendered. At the end of the day, it was issued and had never been deactivated in the system because the deactivation was a manual step that required the front desk to log the card as returned or void. A 3-month-old temporary pass for a company that no longer existed in the building was still generating valid access anywhere in the building. Howard said he was on his way up and to stay at my desk. Part 5. The lightning strike that affected the building's power hit at 11:32. The floor went dark, all the overheads, my monitors, the corridor lights, everything. The emergency lighting activated floor-level strips, giving the space that specific, low red glow that changes every familiar room into something unrecognizable. My desk lamp, which ran on a separate circuit from a battery backup strip, stayed on and gave me a small circle of yellow light. I picked up my desk phone to call Howard, and the desk phone was dead. It ran on the building's main power. My cell was on the desk. I picked it up and called Howard's cell, which he had given me when we finished the previous call. It rang 4 times and went to voicemail. I tried the building's main security desk number from a card on my desk. No answer. I sat in the small circle of my desk lamp, and I listened to the storm, and I thought about my options. The elevator would not be running on emergency power, which meant the stairs were the only way off the floor. The stairwell door was at the end of the north corridor, past the conference room 30 feet from where I was sitting. I heard the stairwell door open, not the elevator. The stairwell, the heavy fire door at the end of the north corridor opening with the specific sound of the push bar and the pneumatic closer, and then footsteps in the corridor. Not Howard's footsteps, which I had heard twice before on this floor during his rounds, and which were heavy and regular. These were measured slower, the kind of pace that knows where it is going, and is not in any hurry to get there. I could see the corridor from my desk. The emergency lighting gave me enough to see a figure enter the corridor from the stairwell end, moving toward the open plan area, toward my desk lamp, toward the circle of yellow light that was making me visible from 30 feet away, while I could not clearly see anything outside of it. Part 6. I grabbed my laptop from the desk. I want to be clear that what I did next was not a plan so much as a combination of available objects and available space, and about 2 seconds to act. I threw the laptop toward the corridor entrance, not at the figure to the side. The laptop hitting the door frame and clattering to the floor and making significantly more noise than I had expected. The figure stopped. I ran left away from the corridor to the conference room, which was the nearest room with a door that locked from the inside. I got in and turned the lock and moved to the far end of the table away from the door, and I called 911. The conference room had windows on the north face of the building. 14 stories up downtown Denver, the street below visible through the rain and the lightning. I unlocked the window and pushed it open, and the wind and rain came in immediately, and I leaned out and I yelled. Not words, just volume as much as I could produce sustained. 2 people on the street below looked up. One of them had their phone out within 30 seconds. Howard made it up the stairwell from the lobby, climbing 14 flights in 11 minutes. I heard him in the corridor calling my name, and I heard the door handle, and he identified himself and gave me his badge number. which I had written on the card on my desk and had memorized in the time I was waiting in the conference room. I opened the door. Howard had a second security officer with him. Denver PD were in the building 2 minutes after that. Part 7. They found the man on the floor in the open plan area near the corridor entrance, where I had thrown the laptop. He had not left. He had 3 prior offenses for assault and robbery in commercial buildings. After hours, all targeting individuals working late alone. His method was consistent across all 3. He identified buildings with poor after-hours access control, obtained temporary passes that were not properly voided, and returned to the building during late hours when he knew single occupants were present. The building's entire temporary pass database was audited within 48 hours of the incident. 47 active temporary passes were found in the system that had not been properly voided. Some were months old. 3 were over a year old. All 47 were deactivated. I gave a full statement and testified at the preliminary hearing. He pled guilty to 3 of the 4 charges. Part 8. I do not work late alone anymore. It is a policy I made for myself, without anyone requiring it of me, and I have kept it without exception for 2 years. If I need to stay past 7, I arrange for someone else to stay as well, even if they are working on something completely unrelated to me, in a completely different part of the floor. The presence of another person is the variable I can control most directly. What I think about is the second visit. He came back to ask if I was alone. He had assessed the floor on the first visit, and he had one specific piece of information he needed to confirm before he committed to the next step, and he came back to get it. He asked me directly, and I lied directly, and he went back to the elevator. He believed the lie for 14 minutes, and then he came up the stairwell. I do not know what changed his mind in those 14 minutes. Maybe he thought about the floor layout and concluded the dark corridor behind me did not support the presence of other people. Maybe he made a different calculation about the risk and decided the potential upside was worth proceeding regardless. Whatever it was, he committed to the stairwell 14 minutes after I told him I was not alone. The lie bought me 14 minutes. I do not know what I would have done without those 14 minutes. Tell it if you have to. Buy whatever time you can. And know where the conference room is before you ever need to run to it in the dark. Story 3. The Woman at Pump 7. Part 1. My name is Andre. I am 31 years old, and I want to tell you about a Friday night in September when I was working the overnight shift at a large gas station on the outskirts of Atlanta, Georgia, and a woman pulled up to Pump 7 at 1:55 in the morning, put $17 of gas in her car, and then sat in the car with her lights off and did not leave. She had been sitting there for 20 minutes when she finally came inside, and what she said to me quietly over the counter, without looking up from the floor, changed the entire character of the next 45 minutes. There was a thunderstorm coming in from the southwest, the sky doing what it does in Georgia in September, when the pressure changes fast. And by the time it arrived, everything that was already happening was already at the point where there was no good version of the next 10 minutes. Stay with me, because the part about the camera at the corner light is what made all of this real to the police when they arrived. Part 2. The station was a large one, 8 pumps under a wide canopy, a convenience store attached with a hot food counter that ran until 2 a.m. and a car wash around the back that closed at midnight. I worked the counter from 10 p.m. to 6 a.m. 4 nights a week with one other staff member. Whoever was scheduled for the kitchen which that night was a man named Terrell, who made sandwiches and fried food from the back counter, and generally stayed in his section unless something required him in the front. By 1 in the morning on a Friday, the traffic through the station had slowed to occasional. Mostly people coming off the highway who needed gas or a coffee before the next stretch. The storm that had been sitting on the western horizon since around midnight was moving in slowly the way Atlanta storms do in September, building their charge and taking their time. I noticed the car at pump 7 because after she finished pumping and replaced the nozzle, she got back in and the lights went off. Not the engine, which I could see was still running from the faint exhaust visible under the canopy. Just the headlights off the car settled in the dark under the canopy sitting. I watched it for 5 minutes, and then 10, and then 15. And then at 20 minutes, the driver's door opened, and a woman walked toward the store entrance. Part 3. She was in her late 20s, wearing a light jacket that was not enough for the temperature. She came to the counter, and she picked up a bottle of water from the cooler near the register, and she set it down in front of me, and she did not look at me directly. She looked at the counter. She said in a low voice, barely above the ambient noise of the store, that someone had been following her since she left her friend's house on the north side, and she did not know what to do. And could she please stay inside for a few minutes? Her hands were on the counter, and I could see that they were not steady. I said yes. I said of course. I said, stay right here. And I moved the stool from behind the register to the counter side away from the window, and I told her to sit. She sat. I looked out at the pumps. The canopy was lit and the forecourt was lit, and the area directly in front of the store was visible from where I was standing. I looked at the street entrance to the station, the 2 lanes in from the main road, and I looked at the pump lanes, and I looked at the dark strip along the far edge of the property, where the car wash building created a shadow that the overhead lights did not fully reach. At 1:58, a dark SUV turned into the station from the main road. Part 4. It did not go to a pump. It turned left inside the lot away from the pump lanes, and it went to the far right corner of the property near the car wash shadow, and it stopped. The lights went off. The engine did not go off. I could see the faint exhaust rising in the cooler air at the edge of the canopy light's reach. Nobody got out. I looked at the woman. She was looking at the counter in front of her. I did not tell her yet what I had just seen. I went to the camera monitor behind the counter, a small screen that ran the feeds from the 6 exterior cameras. I pulled up the street camera, which was mounted at the canopy edge, aimed at the station entrance and the intersection beyond. I went back through the footage 3 minutes. The SUV had come through the intersection behind the woman's car, not immediately behind 2 car lengths back. But the timestamp showed the woman's car entering the station at 1:54, and the SUV following through the same intersection at 1:55. 1 minute behind her, into the same lot. I went further back. The street camera had a partial view of the main road approaching the intersection from the north, which was the direction the woman had come from. I could see the woman's car stop at the traffic light 1 block north. The SUV was behind her at that light. I went back further. 2 lights north of the station. The SUV was behind her at that light, also 3 car lengths back, maintaining consistent spacing. He had followed her through at least 3 traffic lights and into this station. Part 5. I called Terrell from the back on the intercom and told him to come to the front. He came out wiping his hands, and I leaned over and told him quietly what was outside and what was on the camera, and I told him to stay near the counter and not go near the windows. The storm was arriving now. The first serious lightning came in from the southwest, striking somewhere a few miles out, and the thunder followed it after a few seconds, and the rain started not gradually, but all at once the specific way. Heavy rain arrives in Atlanta, a wall of it that reduced the visibility at the edges of the canopy to almost nothing. The interior lights of the store flickered with the lightning strike. Once, twice the kind of flicker that precedes an outage in a station that is running on the grid without a full backup. I looked at the camera monitor. The SUV in the far corner was still there, engine running. And then, in the flicker of the lights, in the brief strobing of the fluorescence, I saw the driver's door of the SUV open. The lights came back to full. I looked at the corner where the SUV was parked. The driver's door was open. The driver was not in the car. I could not see where he had gone in the rain and the dark. I looked at the woman. She was looking at me now, and I could see she knew something had changed in my expression. I looked at the store entrance. The door was a standard commercial glass door with an electronic lock that I could engage from a switch behind the counter. I looked at the door. The man was on the other side of it, standing directly outside his hand, on the handle looking through the glass. Part 6. I hit the lock switch. The click was audible, and the man's hand tested the handle and found it locked, and he looked through the glass directly at me. He was mid-30s, heavy build, wearing a dark jacket soaked through with rain. His expression was not angry. It was patient and flat in the way that is worse than angry. I told Terrell to call 911 right now. I moved the woman away from the counter, away from the direct window line to the back of the store near the refrigerated cases. I hit every exterior light switch on the panel behind the counter, the ones that controlled the canopy, floods, the perimeter, lights, the car wash area lights. The entire station went bright. The man outside the door did not move for a moment. He stood in the full light with his hand on the locked door, and he looked at me through the glass. And then he looked toward the woman who was now behind the refrigerator cases and not visible to him. Terrell was on with 911. I had the counter between me and the door. The man stepped back from the door. He went back toward the SUV in the now fully lit lot. He got in. The SUV reversed toward the exit and then stopped partially in the exit lane, not leaving idling. The police units came from two directions, one from the main road north and one from the highway entrance ramp to the south lights going, and the SUV did not have enough room to go either direction without driving toward one of them. Part 7. He was taken out of the SUV in the station lot with the rain coming down and the full station lights on, and Terrell and I watching from inside the locked store. The woman was seated on a case of water bottles in the back of the store with a bottle of water in both hands, and she did not move until the officer knocked on the glass and identified herself. The officer who took my statement told me the man had 2 prior reports of following women in vehicles at night, both filed in the past 18 months, both in adjacent counties, neither of which had resulted in arrest, because in both cases, the woman had managed to get to safety, and the man had not been located in time. He was known to the department by description, but had not been charged. The camera footage from the street camera showing 3 consecutive traffic lights with his SUV maintaining position behind her car was the piece of evidence the officer said was most significant for what came next in terms of the case. Part 8. I was given a commendation by the regional manager 2 weeks later. I put it in a drawer. I was glad the woman was safe, and I was glad Terrell was there, and I was glad the lock switch worked, and none of those things required a commendation to make them feel like the right things. What I think about most is the lighting. The man stood outside a locked glass door in full light for almost 30 seconds before he made the decision to step back. The light did not make him leave. The sirens made him leave. But the light took away the calculation he had been running, the one that depended on uncertainty and visibility gaps, and the dark strip by the car wash where he had parked for a reason. Full light removed the conditions he had chosen and put him in conditions he hadn't. Environmental control is not nothing. It is not everything. But it is not nothing. I still work that station. I engage the door lock every night at midnight without exception. The switch is behind the counter to my left, and I hit it the same way I hit the coffee machine automatically, as part of the sequence of what midnight means on that shift. When a car comes into your lot and does not go to a pump, watch it. Watch where it parks. Watch whether anyone gets out and where they go. You have cameras. Use them before you need them. Story 4. The Photography Studio. Part 1. My name is Claire. I am 25 years old, and I want to tell you about a Monday night in October when I was alone in my photography studio in Minneapolis, Minnesota, editing a client session, and I received an email from a man who had been sending me hostile messages for 3 weeks and 10 minutes after I deleted it. The buzzer to my studio rang. It was 12:30 in the morning, and the thunderstorm that had been building all evening was overhead. Now the lightning close enough to count seconds on. I want to tell you about the moment I looked at the camera mounted above my studio door and saw the face of the man who had sent me 20 emails in 21 days and understood that he had found out where I worked, despite the fact that I had never told him. If you run any kind of independent creative business from a studio or a shared workspace, this one matters to you specifically. Part 2. I had been renting the studio for 14 months. It was a single room on the 3rd floor of a mixed-use building in the Whittier neighborhood, the kind of building that had photography studios and graphic design offices and a ceramics co-op on the upper floors and a coffee shop at street level. The building had a front door entry code for residents and tenants, and a buzzer system for visitors, and the studio itself had a secondary door lock that I controlled. The client whose session I was editing had been a referral, a man who had booked a professional headshot session 8 weeks earlier. The session had gone normally, and I had delivered the final images, and he had paid, and I had considered the job complete. 3 weeks after delivery, he had sent me an email asking me to remove his images from my portfolio. I had explained that he had signed a model release at the time of booking, granting me the right to use the images for portfolio purposes, which was standard in my contracts. He had responded with a second email that was longer and angrier. The emails had continued from there, 20 of them over 21 days, the tone escalating from hostile to threatening across the sequence. I had not responded to any of them after the 3rd one, and I'd been in the process of consulting with a lawyer about the options available to me. The email that arrived at 12:20 that night was the 21st. I read the first 2 sentences and closed it, and deleted it, and blocked the sender address for the 4th time on the 4th new account he had used. At 12:30, the buzzer rang. Part 3. I did not answer it. I sat at my editing desk and I looked at the buzzer panel on the wall, and I waited. It rang again. Then a 3rd time. Then a 4th. Then silence. 30 seconds of silence, and then a knock on the door. Not the buzzer, the door itself. A knock from inside the building's 3rd floor hallway, which meant whoever had rung the buzzer had either been let in by another tenant or had known the entry code. The knock was quiet and deliberate. Not the knock of someone who needed help or was in a hurry. The knock of someone who knew I was inside and was communicating that they knew. My studio door had a small camera mounted above it, an interior unit aimed at the hallway outside the feed, visible on a tablet mounted beside my desk. I had installed it 6 months ago when the building had a rash of package thefts and had never had reason to think about it as anything other than a package monitoring tool. I looked at the tablet. The man standing in the hallway outside my door was the man from the headshot session. He was standing close to the door, looking directly at the camera, which meant looking directly at me through the camera, which meant he knew the camera was there. Part 4. I sat very still with the tablet in my hand, and I looked at his face on the screen, and I tried to think clearly. He was here. He was in the building. He had either known the entry code or had come in with another tenant, and either way, he was in the 3rd floor hallway outside my studio at 12:30 in the morning. I opened my email on my phone. I went back through the 21 messages, something I had been avoiding doing because reading them made my hands tighten. I was looking for something specific, a detail that would tell me how he had found this building. The 17th email sent 3 days ago contained a sentence where he described the color of the paint on the exterior wall of a building he referenced as my place of business. A specific color, a deep teal, which was the color of the Whittier building's exterior. I had never mentioned the building in any communication with him. I had never posted the studio address on my website or my social media. My website listed a contact form and a general neighborhood, not an address, but my social media had location tags on photographs going back 2 years. Photographs taken inside this studio and in the alley behind it and on the corner of the street outside. Location tags I had not thought about as information about where I worked every week, because I had not been thinking about someone using them to find me. He had spent 3 weeks working backward through my tagged posts to build an address. Part 5. The knock came again. Still quiet, still deliberate. I opened the studio's tenant group text a thread that all 8 studios on the floor used for building communication. I typed quickly, anyone on the 3rd floor awake right now, urgent. Within 40 seconds, a reply came from Rob, a graphic designer in the studio 3 doors down, who kept late hours and whose light I had seen under his door when I arrived that evening. He said he was there and asked what was happening. I typed, "There is a man in the hallway outside my door who has been stalking me for 3 weeks. Please come out into the hallway. I am locked inside my studio." The reply came back in 10 seconds. It said, "Coming now." On the tablet, I watched the hallway outside my door. I saw Rob's studio door open at the far end, and Rob step into the hallway, and I watched the man outside my door register Rob's presence. The man turned and looked at Rob, and Rob said something I could not hear through the door, and the man turned back to my door once more, and then turned and moved quickly to the stairwell door at the north end of the hallway and went through it. Rob was already calling 911. Part 6. The police found him at the building's street-level exit, attempting to push through the door to the exterior. The stairwell had a camera at each landing, and the footage showed him descending from 3 to 2 to 1 and pushing through the ground floor exit at street level, where a patrol unit was already at the building perimeter. He was charged with stalking and criminal trespass. During the investigation, it was established that he had visited the block where the building was located on 2 prior occasions, once in daylight and once at night, before the night he attempted to enter. He had been building familiarity with the building's layout before he came inside. The lawyer I had been consulting told me the prior emails constituted a clear stalking pattern, and that the physical appearance at the studio significantly strengthened the case. He pled guilty to the trespass charge and accepted terms on the stalking charge that included a restraining order and a required evaluation. Part 7. I removed every location tag from every post across every platform within 24 hours of the incident, all of them going back to when I started posting. It took 4 hours. I also made my profiles private on 2 platforms and removed the studio's neighborhood reference from my website, replacing it with a contact form only. Rob and I have an informal arrangement now where, if either of us is working alone past 10, we text the other before we leave and after we arrive home. What I think about is the 17th email. He mentioned the paint color. He had been to the building before he sent that email. He had been standing outside looking at the paint 3 days before he rang my buzzer, building his certainty about the address before he committed to coming inside. And he had put the paint color in the email, I think now, as a way of telling me he knew where I was. A way of communicating that the boundary between my digital life and my physical location had already been crossed. I had read the email and deleted it without registering what that detail meant. Go through your location tags. All of them. Every post that shows a street corner, a building exterior, a window view, a parking lot you use regularly. Each of those images is a data point, and a patient person with a reason to find. You can build an address out of data points in less time than you would expect. Your studio, your office, your regular coffee shop. They are findable. Make sure the people who find them are people you have chosen. Story 5. The Back Road to Fairview. Part 1. My name is James. I am 44 years old, and I want to tell you about a Thursday night in January when I was driving home from a late shift on the back road through the rural stretch outside Columbus, Ohio, and my car stalled out in the rain at 1:40 in the morning on a section of road with no houses and no cell service and no lights in any direction. I want to tell you about the truck that stopped to help me and the man who got out of it, and the moment I looked through his passenger window and understood that there was no help coming from this vehicle. The thunderstorm was overhead by the time this started, the lightning illuminating the fields on both sides of the road in flat white every few seconds. And I want to tell you about what I remembered. At the moment, I needed to remember it most. If you drive rural roads late at night, this one matters. Stay with me. Part 2. The back road to Fairview was a 2-lane county road that cut 12 miles through farmland between the industrial park where I worked and the small town where I lived. I had been driving it for 3 years because it saved 15 minutes over the highway route, and at 1 in the morning there was no traffic on it worth mentioning. I knew every mile of it. The long straight section through the cornfields, the slight rise over the creek bridge, the gradual left curve at the grain elevator that put you into the final stretch before the Fairview town limit. My car was a 2016 sedan with 140,000 miles on it that I had been meaning to have looked at for 2 months because it had been hesitating on cold starts. I had been meaning to for 2 months, and I had not. And at 1:40 on a January night in a thunderstorm was paying for that. The hesitation became a stall about 4 miles into the back road section. The engine went rough and then died. and I coasted to the right shoulder and stopped. I turned the key. It turned over and died. I turned it again. Same result. I put the hazards on and picked up my phone. No signal. I moved the phone around the car. No signal anywhere. I had hit this dead zone twice before in the past 3 years. Always on this specific stretch. Always in weather when the signal was weakest. I had always had a working car before. I sat with my hazards blinking orange in the rain, and I thought about my options. And I had not gotten very far in that thinking when headlights appeared in my rearview mirror. Part 3. The truck that slowed and pulled onto the shoulder behind me was a dark pickup. Heavy duty. The kind with the extended cab and the running lights along the roof. The driver's door opened, and a man got out and walked toward my window in the rain. He was big, wearing a canvas work coat, moving with the easy authority of someone accustomed to roadside situations. He knocked on my window, and I lowered it 2 inches. He said he had seen my hazards from up the road, and asked what the trouble was. I told him the engine had stalled and would not restart. He said he had a tow strap in the truck and could pull me to the Fairview garage if I wanted. His voice was normal. His manner was normal. He was a large man in a work coat on a county road in the rain, who had stopped to help a stranded driver, and everything about the surface of it was what it appeared to be. I said I appreciated it, and let me just try the engine once more. I turned the key. The engine caught and ran rough for 3 seconds and died again. I looked at the man, and then I looked past him at his truck. There was no tow strap visible in the truck bed. The bed was empty, not the kind of empty that still has the residue of regular work. Use rope ends and hardware and grime, but clean empty, which was not what a truck belonging to someone who kept tow straps in it looked like in my experience. The passenger window of the cab was visible from my angle, and through it I could see the back seat of the extended cab. On the back seat, there were 2 or 3 coils of rope, and a large duffel bag, the zipper partially open. I looked at the ropes, and I looked at the man, and I looked at his hands, and his hands were at his sides, and he was not looking at me anymore. He was looking at my door handle. Part 4. The passenger door of the truck opened. I had not seen anyone in the passenger seat. The cab had looked dark when the man walked toward me, and I had looked at the back seat, and I had not registered a person in the front. But the passenger door opened, and a second man stepped out into the rain and walked around the front of the truck. And he came up on the passenger side of my car. 2 men, 1 on each side of my car. The first man said something about the tow strap, said he would get it from behind the seat, and he put his hand on my door handle. I had locked the door when I rolled the window down. The handle did not open. He pulled it twice, and it did not open, and he looked at me through the 2-inch gap of the open window. I thought about the road. I had been on this road 3 years, twice a week, and the geometry of it was in my body before it was in my head. 4 miles back to the industrial park, 3 miles forward to Fairview. The creek bridge was a mile ahead, which meant a mile of flat, straight road, with open fields on both sides and no structures. The grain elevator was 2 miles ahead, which was the first building on this road, and which had a light on its exterior 24 hours a day. I thought about something else. I had read 2 local news items in the past year about incidents on this road, both involving motorists who had stopped for apparent breakdowns or been helped by apparent good Samaritans and been robbed. I had read them, and I had thought briefly that the road I drove twice a week had been the site of both incidents. And then I had thought about something else. and I had not thought about those items again until this exact moment. Part 5. The second man was at my passenger window. The first man was at my driver's door, with his hand on the handle that would not open. I turned the key. The engine caught and ran rough. I put the car in drive. It ran rough for 2 seconds, and I pressed the accelerator, and the car moved forward off the shoulder onto the road, and the engine ran rough, and I pressed the accelerator harder, and the engine ran rough. And then at about 15 miles per hour, it smoothed out the same hesitation pattern I had been ignoring for 2 months. Rough at low RPM, and smoothing as the engine warmed. I put every light on that the car had. Headlights hazard still blinking the interior dome light. I pressed the horn and held it. Not a tap. Held it a sustained, loud sound going forward into the dark road. The road was straight for a mile ahead of me, and the headlights reached a good distance. And about a third of a mile ahead, I could see something in the oncoming lane. Headlights moving toward me, a large vehicle moving at highway speed. A semi, the high, wide headlights of a truck southbound on this road. I flashed my lights at it, high beam, low beam, high beam. The universal signal on a 2-lane road at night, and I kept the horn going, and the semi slowed as it approached me, and I could see the air brakes as it came down in speed, and it pulled to the right shoulder as it stopped, and the driver's door opened, and a man in a high visibility vest climbed down from the cab. Part 6. I pulled up alongside the semi and stopped, and the driver, a man named Gene, who was hauling for a refrigerated freight company, came to my window, and I told him in 30 seconds what had happened. Gene was 50 or so solid, and he listened without expression, and then he looked back down the road behind me. The dark pickup had not followed me. Its headlights were visible a half-mile back, stationary on the shoulder where I had been stalled, and as Gene and I watched, they went off. Then the sound of the truck's engine faint in the rain, and the truck pulled back onto the road and turned around and went back north the way it had come. Gene called 911 from his cab. He had a Signal commercial truck systems boosted in dead zones for exactly this kind of situation. He stayed with me until the Franklin County Sheriff's deputy arrived about 22 minutes, and he let me sit in the warm cab of his semi while we waited. Part 7. The deputy took my statement, and took Gene's statement, and ran the description of the truck and the partial plate I had managed to read through my mirror as the truck turned around. Within 48 hours, the detectives on the case contacted me to tell me the truck had been identified, and the 2 men connected to it matched the descriptions from both prior incidents on that road. The prior incidents had both involved successful robberies. In the first, the victim had been pulled from the car. In the second, the victim had been threatened with a weapon and complied. Both victims had been alone on the road late at night. Both vehicles had been stalled, or appeared to be stalled. The detectives asked me how I had managed to get the car moving. I told them about the cold start hesitation and how it had smoothed at higher RPM. One of them said that was fortunate timing, and I said yes, it was. And I did not mention that I had been meaning to get it looked at for 2 months, because that detail did not seem useful to anyone at that point. Part 8. I had the car serviced the following week. The mechanic found a fuel injector issue that had been developing for months and fixed it for $300. I do not take the back road anymore. I drive the highway, which adds 15 minutes each way, and I have made my peace with the 30 minutes. The time is worth it. I keep my phone charged above 80% before I leave for any night shift. I have a battery jump starter in the trunk. I have roadside assistance on my insurance. All things I had before, and none of which helped me on that road, because the phone had no signal and the car would not start. And roadside assistance requires a phone call to use. The thing that helped me was the horn and the lights and the semi that happened to be on that road, and the cold start hesitation in my engine that cleared at 15 miles per hour, and Gene pulling into the shoulder when he saw lights flashing in the dark. Luck is not a strategy, but noticing what luck looks like when it appears in front of you and using it immediately, that is something you can do. The semi's headlights appeared, and I used every light and every sound I had to reach them before they passed. Use what you have. Use it all at once. Do not save any of it. Story 6. The Pediatric Clinic After Hours. Part 1. My name is Nina. I am 33 years old. And I want to tell you about a Monday night in March when I was working alone after hours at the pediatric clinic, where I was employed in a suburb of Seattle, Washington, catching up on patient documentation that I had not been able to finish during the regular day. And I heard the sound of a child crying from the other side of the door that separated the staff area from the patient waiting room that had been locked and dark since 6 p.m. It was 10:45 at night, and the thunderstorm outside had been going for 3 hours, and I was the only staff member in the building. I want to tell you about what I found when I turned on the waiting room light, and what the woman sitting in the corner chair communicated to me through a pane of glass without saying a word. If you work in any kind of medical or care facility, and sometimes stay late alone, stay with me all the way to the end. Part 2. The clinic was a small pediatric practice, 4 exam rooms, a waiting area, a staff corridor running the back of the building with the nurses' station, and the documentation room, and a supply closet, and the back entrance that opened to the staff parking strip. We saw patients from 8 to 5 Monday through Friday, and on occasional Saturdays. And I had been a registered nurse there for 2 years. Staying late for documentation was something I did once or twice a month, when the daytime flow had been too heavy to keep up with the charting in real time. The last doctor left at 6, the front desk staff at 6:15. I usually stayed until 8 or 9 finished the remaining charts and left through the back entrance to my car. That Monday, I had stayed later than usual. The previous week had been heavy, and I had a stack of charts to reconcile before Tuesday's schedule. I had been at my desk in the documentation room since 6:30, with coffee and the sound of the storm and the specific quiet of a building that has emptied out and settled into itself. By 10:40, I was close to done. The storm had peaked around 9 and was now in its sustained phase, steady rain and intermittent thunder, the kind of weather that made the building's old roof gutters audible as they moved water. I was half listening to the gutters and half focused on the chart in front of me when I heard the other sound. It came from the direction of the waiting room, a child crying the sustained, unhappy cry of a young child who was tired and frightened and had been crying for some time. Not a sharp, distressed cry, a long, low, exhausted cry that had been going on before I noticed it, and was still going when I lifted my head to listen. Part 3. I sat on my desk, and I listened, and I identified the direction. It was not from outside. The building's exterior sounds came in through the roof and the windows in a way I had learned over 2 years. And this was not that. It was interior. It was coming from the waiting room side of the door between the staff corridor and the patient waiting area that was kept locked after hours, with a push bar release on the staff side. I went to the door. It had a small rectangular wire mesh glass panel at eye level. The standard safety glass view panel on medical facility interior doors. I looked through it into the waiting room. The waiting room was dark. The overhead lights were off, and the only illumination was the red glow of the exit sign above the front entrance door and the faint ambient light from the parking lot security lights filtering through the blinds on the front window. In that light, I could see the waiting room in rough shapes, the row of seats along the left wall, the children's play corner with the low table and the plastic chairs, the reception window shuttered, the coat rack by the door, and in the far right corner, in the seat farthest from the reception window, a shape. A person sitting, and in their arms a smaller shape, a child, and the crying was coming from the child. I reached for the corridor light switch and turned on the waiting room lights from the staff side panel. Part 4. The woman in the corner chair flinched when the light came on. She was in her late 20s, or early 30s, wearing a jacket that was soaked through, as if she had been in the rain. The child in her arms was small, 2 or 3 years old, with its face pressed against her shoulder. The woman looked at me through the glass panel in the door, with eyes that were swollen and a face that was on the left side, visibly injured. A bruise covering the cheek, and the eye socket not old, the coloration still in its dark, early phase. She looked at me for a long moment, and then she shook her head. A clear, deliberate, unhurried shake. Then she looked down at the child, and then back at me, and she shook her head again. She did not want me to open the door. I stood at the panel, and I looked at her, and I tried to understand what the head shake meant in context. Not come in here. Not open this door. Which from a woman with fresh bruising sitting in a locked, darkened waiting room at 10:45 at night with a frightened child was information I took seriously. I went back to my desk, and I opened the clinic's camera management system on my computer. We had 3 cameras. One above the front entrance aimed at the parking lot, one in the waiting room, one in the staff corridor. I pulled up the waiting room camera and went back through the footage. At 9:55, the front entrance door had opened. The woman had come in with the child moving fast, the child held against her chest, and she had gone to the far corner and sat down. The entrance door had been unlocked at 9:55, which was the tail end of the period when I was still intermittently going to the front to check the mail slot, and it had locked behind her when she came in. She had been in that waiting room for 45 minutes in the dark. I pulled up the parking lot camera. A man was on the sidewalk outside the clinic, moving back and forth in front of the entrance, at a pace that was not a person waiting for a bus or waiting out the rain. It was the pacing of someone who was maintaining proximity to a specific location. Part 5. I looked at the woman through the glass panel, and I pointed to my phone and mimed dialing, and she nodded. I called 911, and I kept my voice low, and I gave the dispatcher the address and told her there was a woman and a young child sheltering in the locked waiting room of the clinic, that the woman had visible injuries consistent with assault, and that there was a male subject pacing outside the building's entrance. The dispatcher told me to keep the woman inside, keep myself inside, and that units were coming. I looked at the corridor camera on my monitor while I was on the phone. The back door of the clinic, the staff entrance on the parking strip side, was visible on the corridor camera. I watched it. As I watched, the handle moved. Not a full attempt at the door, just a test of the handle. Someone on the outside checking whether it was locked. It was locked. The handle released. Then it tested again harder. I looked at the woman through the glass panel. She was watching me with an expression that was reading my face for information. And she saw something in it, because she pulled the child closer and looked toward the back of the waiting room, toward the door that connected the waiting room to the first exam room hallway, which was a door I had not thought about until this moment. That door was not locked from the waiting room side. It was a patient flow door push to open, designed to allow patients to move from the waiting room into the exam corridor when called. It had no lock. It opened into the exam corridor, which connected to the staff corridor, which connected to the back entrance. If someone came through the back entrance into the staff corridor, they would reach the exam corridor door within 20 feet. Part 6. I moved fast. I pulled the heavy rolling file cabinet from beside my desk into the staff corridor and positioned it against the exam corridor door, which opened toward me. The cabinet weighed enough that it would not move easily. I moved a second chair under the handle for additional resistance. I went back to the glass panel, and I looked at the woman, and I pointed down, which I hoped communicated stay low, and she understood. And she slid from the chair to the floor in the corner and held the child. I called the dispatcher back and told her about the back entrance and the exam corridor door, and she said units were 90 seconds out. The back entrance handle tested again, harder, a sustained pressure this time, and then a knock 3 times, and a voice. The voice said her name, quietly, with the specific intimate tone of someone who has said a name quietly many times before and knows the effect it produces. The child in the waiting room made a sound and went quiet. I heard the exam corridor door on the other side of my barricade flex against the cabinet. Once. Twice. The cabinet moved an inch and stopped. I put my back against it. The lights outside swept through the parking strip window. Then the front, the lights of a second unit. Then voices outside both entrances, clear and authoritative, the specific volume of police who know the situation and are communicating their presence deliberately. The pressure against the exam corridor door stopped. Part 7. They took the man at the back entrance. A second man, someone I had not known was there, was found in the parking lot adjacent to the building, apparently positioned to watch the back exit. He had no explanation for his presence and matched a description from a prior domestic disturbance report, connected to the same address. The woman and the child were brought into the staff area by a female officer, and I sat with them in the documentation room while the building was cleared. The child fell asleep on the examination table in exam room 2 within 15 minutes of the officers arriving. The specific, exhausted sleep of a child who has been frightened for a long time and has finally been given permission to stop. The woman's injuries were documented by the responding officers, and she was transported to a hospital for evaluation and then to a family shelter with the child. I gave a full statement that night and a follow-up statement 2 days later. Part 8. I wrote a formal proposal to the clinic's medical director the following week. The proposal covered 4 things: a camera on the back entrance exterior, which we did not have; a secure staff-only lock on the exam corridor door, accessible from both sides; a protocol for staff working after hours alone that included a required check-in with an on-call contact every hour after 7 p.m., and a document for the front desk outlining what to do if a patient or a person seeking safety arrived outside clinic hours and needed to access the building. The medical director approved all 4 items. The camera and the locks were installed within 3 weeks. I did not stop working late after hours. I did it again 2 weeks after the incident, and I have done it since. I made a decision that the work needed to be done, and that I was not going to allow one night to remove a capability I had used usefully for 2 years. But I do not do it alone. The clinic arranged a system where any staff member staying after 7 has a designated on-call contact who checks in by text on a set schedule. And if the check-in is missed, the contact calls. And if the call is not answered, the contact calls the building's emergency line. What I think about most is the woman shaking her head. She had found a locked medical building with the lights off, and she had come in through a door that happened to be briefly unlocked, and she had gone to the farthest corner from the entrance, and she had sat in the dark for 45 minutes with a child, and she had not made a sound, because making a sound was not safe, until she saw a face at the glass panel and made a calculation in the half second she had that it was a face she could communicate with. She communicated with a head shake, and I understood it and acted on it. That is the whole mechanism of what kept the door between us closed until it was safe to open it. Pay attention to what people are telling you without words. In the moments that matter, most words are sometimes the last resource available, and everything that needs to be communicated is moving through gesture and eye contact. And the small signals that a person in danger uses when speaking is not an option. She shook her head and I understood her. That is the part I carry with me.